My name is John Dukovich. I'm with Green Moon Solutions. It's a small technology company in the Washington, D.C. area. I've been working with Microsoft Office applications for basically since they've come out, and I'm a heavy user of Excel and Excel macros in the Visual Basic for Applications language. I do quite a few applications for clients and use the macros in ways that a lot of people don't. Instead of just manipulating spreadsheet information, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes calculation and user kind of GUI interface things that I do with them. So I'm quite familiar with the macros. I shied away from calc for quite a while because initially I heard the macro feature wasn't as good as Excel's. And also years ago there wasn't a good conversion between the two. However, when I got my hands on this book here, OpenOffice.org Spreadsheet Macro Programming, I was curious to see. Hopefully I was wrong. Hopefully this will open up new opportunities for clients and organizations that want to get away from Microsoft Office, who are already using OpenOffice. And so I was really curious to see the level of capability that calc had in its macro programming. So with that background, overall, I found the book to be very informative to someone like me. It almost felt like it was kind of written for someone like me, but I try to step back from that because of the experience of a lot of my clients who are not programmers, who don't have a lot of technical background, who use spreadsheets the way a lot of people do, as lists and databases and things like that. So I try to step back and from their point of view look at it and just to think, would this book help me out if I was in that situation? And I think for some people it would, and it would at least give them an idea of the capabilities that are there. However, there are several times in the book where the author says, okay, here's how we do this, and now we're going to move on to something else. So if you're interested in exploring this in more detail, go to this website. Go to the OpenOffice.org site where they have the detailed user guides and that type of thing.
If somebody uses OpenOffice 3, would this book written for OpenOffice 2 still be applicable?
That's a great question, and I was wondering that myself. I use OpenOffice 3, and I tested a lot of the macros on both the Windows version and the Ubuntu version, and version 3. And other than a few little dialog box differences, a few things got moved around a little bit. This book is still quite applicable to version 3. The capabilities, the functions, the techniques, everything is pretty much still the same. There's just a few differences in say, menu options and that type of thing. But it's nothing like going from Microsoft Office 2003 to 2007 where it's a complete rewrite. So this book is still applicable.
Let me ask you this question. So Excel macro language is very powerful, right? What ways does OpenOffice Calc, what macro capabilities does it have that you might have been surprised about? Did you explain?
Well, one thing I was really concerned about is the dialog boxes, and in Excel they're called user forms, where you set up sort of the GUI, the interface, where people could use drop-down boxes and buttons and radio buttons and that type of thing to provide input or whatnot. And what I did is I had 3 different levels of Excel spreadsheets with macros in them. I have what I call like a really basic one, an intermediate one, and a very, very complex one that I imported them into Calc. And I was quite surprised, in a good way, that all the dialog boxes came over perfectly. I didn't have to edit them one bit. And the functionality of the dialog boxes was there, the macros that were tied to the various buttons, everything in that regard worked. So I was quite pleased. The thing that I did find, though, there are some functions that don't translate. And so when I did my very basic level spreadsheet, everything transferred fine. The macros ran. It was wonderful. In the intermediate one, I had to tweak a few things. It's just, I guess, the way that Calc references certain spreadsheet objects that are different than Excel that doesn't quite translate over. In the very complex one, I have some functions that I think are going to need a complete rewrite. In a more detailed programming sense, there are a lot of data structures that are set up in that one that did not translate over. So, and I didn't quite expect them to. I was, trying to test the limits of the thing. But overall, I think for most users, if you're working in Excel, and you need to bring something into Calc, it's going to work quite well, which is also good news for say, students or nonprofit organizations that have smaller budgets or can't afford to buy Microsoft Office. If you want to use OpenOffice, and I think you'll be in great shape, and especially if you have to share documents with people who are using Microsoft Office, I think in most cases, other than in where you have very, very complex situations, I think in most cases it's going to translate quite well. So in terms of the writing style of the book, it was pretty easy to read. I used an example, a continuing story throughout the book of a detective agency and how they were using macros, and sort of as the story went on, they had to do more and more complicated things, and so then he would introduce a chapter with the story, the next continuing saga of the story, and then show some examples, talk about how you would implement those things in Calc. Now, the interesting thing about that is, though, it left me wanting for more. I felt that he would introduce a concept, show a very quick, pretty simple example about that, and then he would refer you to online material, not that he's written, but to the OpenOffice.org site for more information. And I found myself several times saying, well, couldn't you have gone into a little more detail? Couldn't you have shown the next step? That type of thing. And I started thinking, people reading this book may not really understand the power of macros. And again, I'll go back to my very initial point, that is, I think this book is not written for beginners. So I think it would have helped for him to discuss more, how macros are powerful, how they can help the common person, and what are some of the most common uses of macros. Well, you have long lists of data. You can use macros to sort through that data. You can use macros to pull out pieces of information. You can use macros to automate some charts and graphs and things like that, and for formatting. And he does discuss those things, but in not a lot of great detail. Something I use macros a lot for. Often I'll set up a workbook so that there will be an initial sheet where the user will type in different values of parameters. Say they want to do some sort of economic analysis, and so they want to know, what's the time period, so they can type in a number for the time period. What's the interest rate? What's the average cost of something? That type of thing. So there's an initial sheet full of all of these values. And the macro then does a real complex calculation behind that. And so what it does, it goes to the first sheet, it grabs all of those variable values, does the calculation behind the scenes, and then it spits out on another sheet a table of values, or a summary table or something like that, and possibly some charts and things involved like that. And he doesn't really discuss that type of input, churning of numbers, and then output type of thing, which macros are extremely powerful for, and they make spreadsheets, complicated spreadsheet models accessible to more people. So I'd have liked to see more explanation along those lines, more examples. So, another observation is that, in looking at the book, it may be that the author had been constrained to a certain page count or whatnot, and that may be why he could not go into great depth in a lot of examples, and why for other instances he refers people to external sources for more information. So the book it's good. Overall, it's a good book. It provides a good amount of information to get going with the macros, but it could also be a launching pad for possibly a reissue of this book in a digital format, something for the Kindle or the iPad. I think that where there's no page constraint, where possibly additional authors or volunteer authors could be brought in to provide more material, provide more examples, link to more examples in a hypertext format. So I think that's an opportunity. And since we have a new version of Calc out, version 3, it's a good opportunity for the author to update the book a little bit and then possibly go into that digital publishing direction. I'd like to give the publisher credit for putting out this book. They took a risk to put out a book that covers open source software. Now, all my friends and colleagues are quite aware of it and use it. However, in the general public, it's not as widely known. So they weren't quite sure who their audience might be or how big it might be. So they should get credit for putting this book out, and hopefully we'll get more people interested in OpenOffice. And even if someone doesn't view themselves as, say, a macro user, I think it's still a good idea to go ahead and purchase this book, get familiar with it, and also use that as a way to vote for more books on open source software. Use your dollars as your vote, and show that there is support for this type of software, and we need more books out there to help people figure out how to use the software and to actually see how beneficial it could be.